Good morning, everyone. This is Karma Lichty Bombing, joining you this Friday morning. Thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. As you are fully aware, we will be looking at some Photoshop text techniques this morning. Before we get into the contents of this webinar, just a bit of logistics. You'll see the video on your page. And then right below that is a form that you are more than welcome to fill out if you have questions or comments as we go through the webinar. So don't hesitate to do that. I love interaction, so if you have any questions or comments, simply fill that out, click send, and I will see that on my end, and then we'll address it in the webinar. All right, I think that's it as far as logistics. If you have any issues, make sure you refresh your page. Google Hangouts sometimes it's a great platform, but sometimes it gives us a little bit of headache, so don't hesitate to refresh your page if there's any issues with the video and or the audio. I do training on Photoshop on the third and fourth Fridays of each month. The first two Fridays are devoted to WordPress training. And as mentioned this morning, we're going to cover 5 Photoshop text techniques. And I've used Photoshop for many years. I was first started using Photoshop as a web designer, and then also went back for some more training and have used it as a graphic designer as well. So anything from creating headers to combining images, creating posters, creating flyers, etc. I've done inside Photoshop. And this morning, I want to cover how to make your text pop when you're working on a Photoshop document or working with Photoshop images. It's very easy to add text to a document, but we're going to cover a little bit more than that and also look at some, what I consider some nice effects in making your text really pop with your documents that I've experienced over the years that I have used Photoshop. As I mentioned, in this morning's webinar, we're going to be looking at 5 what I call notable Photoshop text effects. These are effects that I've used over the years that I think really help to make our text pop or make it fit better in with the document that we're putting together, whether it's a printed piece, whether it's some kind of presentation, whether it's going to a website. Before we look into those text effects, I want to look at the text tool and just go do a quick overview of the text tool or the type tool, and make sure we're familiar with the most common settings that we need to be aware of when using the type tool or the text tool. And then we'll get into the text effects. The 5 effects we will be covering this morning. We're going to look at what I call gradient text. So instead of just a solid color text, we'll have text that is a gradient of maybe 2 colors or maybe more. Then we'll look at how to put our images inside our text. We'll look how to create 3D text. Then we'll look how to put text on a path or a shape. Maybe we want to put text on a wavy line, or maybe we want to put text around a circle. I'll show you the steps on how to do that. And then we'll close with what my favorite text technique, I need to give this technique some kind of name, but it's a technique I probably use most often, especially when I'm placing text against a busy background. Whether it's some kind of printed piece or design piece I'm putting together, or whether it's just simply text on an image. It's a very simple technique. It's probably the simplest of all these techniques, and I've used it many, many times over the years that I have been using Photoshop. So for each of these techniques, I will review the steps with you, and then I'll actually do these steps inside Photoshop. Before we get started with the gradient text and showing you how to create that, let's take a step back and review the type tool or the text tool. I'm going to jump into Photoshop, and here I just have a blank document that we'll use to review the type tool. I'm going to grab the type tool from our toolbar, and up in the control bar I will leave the settings as is and just type in some text. I've highlighted that text. Now I'm going to bring up what we call the character panel. You can get to the character by clicking on this icon from the control bar when using the text tool, and it'll bring up this character panel. The character panel is where we go to set the most common parameters for using the type tool. For example, here's the font. We can choose, or the size of the font. And the other two options that I use the most in the character panel are these two options. This first option to the right of where we set the font size is what we call the leading for the text. Now I only use this if I'm putting in what I would call paragraph text. So there's lines of text, because the leading will affect the distance between the lines of text. I'll demonstrate that more in just a sec. The other setting right below that is called the kerning. This is the distance between the characters of the text. So for example, right now it's set to a -25. I'm going to do what we call scrub this parameter. When I have the double arrows, as I hover over the icon there in the character panel, I'm just going to simply click and drag. As I increase the amount of the kerning value, notice the characters of the text are further apart. If I scrub to the left, it brings those characters closer together. So that's the kerning. It's the distance between the characters of the text. And there's other parameters here that we can set. We can also set the color from the character panel by simply clicking on the color icon or the color box and choosing a color from the color picker dialog window. Select the shade or the color you want from this rainbow of colors, then select the specific shade in this bigger box that has those shades that I clicked on. You can also do the same thing from up in the control panel, clicking on that color box as well. So the more common parameters used for text are in the control bar. The character panel, you have the same settings as well as some other parameters that give you some other options in defining your text. I want to cover one other aspect of text, another type of text. This is considered headline text when I simply click and type in some text. Paragraph text is another style of text, if you will. To do paragraph text, again, I click on my text tool, then I simply click and drag, and now I'm defining the area to contain the text within. With the headline text, it will simply go off, continue typing to the right. With paragraph text, it will keep it within a defined area. I'm going to select a smaller text and just type in some text here. I'm going to do a copy and paste so I'm not repeating. And you can see how that handles it. Simply wraps the text within that area. If I enlarge this area, it will fill up that area accordingly. So paragraph text is simply that. It's rows of text. Now, if I highlight my paragraph text, this other parameter that I mentioned earlier, the leading in the leading option in the character panel, sets the distance between rows of text. So if I click on this when I have the double arrow hovering over the icon and drag to the right, notice the distance between the lines get larger. If I go to the left, it gets smaller. So that's the leading parameter when using the type tool. So those are the things to be aware of when using the type tool. Just a quick overview to get us all on the same page. Now we're going to go into the gradient text. So with the gradient text, we'll create the text inside Photoshop. Then I'm going to show you two different methods on turning this text into what I call gradient text. The first method is using a layer style, and the second method gives us a little more flexibility in applying the gradient, and I'll show you that method as well. And that's probably the second method is my preferred method. Let's go jump into Photoshop and show you how to create gradient text. We've typed the text in here, and I'm going to show you the layer style first. So I have some text listed here. I'm going to go down here at the bottom of my layers panel is the FX icon, which is what I click on to get the layer styles. And one of the options there is gradient overlay. In the dialog window that pops up after I select gradient overlay, in this drop down next to gradient, I have my different gradient options. And I can select any of these to apply that to my text. I'm going to move this so you can see the text behind it. Now these are gradients that are already set up. In my gradient options. So I can select any of those, click OK, and it applies the gradient. The other method gives me a little more flexibility. So I'm going to grab my text tool again, type in some text. Instead of using the a layer style to apply the gradient overlay, I'm going to actually just use my gradient tool. So I'm going to click off of that to take my text. Now to do this, I need to turn this into what we call a rasterized layer. That simply means I can apply effects to it using my gradient tool. So I'm going to right click on that layer in my layers panel and choose somewhere rasterize type. And that makes it more of an object, if you will, or maybe even an image if you want to think of that. I'm going to select this text now. So I'm taking my cursor in the thumbnail of that layer, holding down Control and clicking on it. Notice the little moving lines I now have around that text. So I've selected that layer. And that's a technique I use quite a bit. I simply go to the Layers panel, hover over the thumbnail of that Layers panel. When I press down Control or Command on the Mac side, notice you get that little box next to your hand on the icon, and then click and it will select that layer. And you're going to get the marching lines around the content of that layer. Now that I have the content of that layer, I can apply a gradient, and I can define the gradient that I want to use. I'm going to go to my gradient tool. Now when I click on my gradient tool, it's going to default to doing a gradient from my foreground to my background color, which in this case is red to black, if you will. I'm going to create my own gradient. By doing that, instead of just going from foreground to background, so I'm going to go up here and I'm going to select any of these gradients actually. If I click on the gradient, I get the gradient editor dialog window, and now I can set my own colors. So actually, let's me do a new gradient, and we're going to call this red, blue. I'm going to go down here and set my colors by clicking on this very left, what we call a color stop. Click on the color, and I think I said red to blue, so I'll choose a red there. Click my far right color stop. Change that to a blue. Notice I'm clicking the color in this rainbow of colors first, and then choosing my shade of that color in this big color box. I'm going to get rid of this one here. That had an extra color stop in it. And I just simply click on that and dragged it down to delete it. So now my red to blue gradient. I'm going to save that. Whoops, not that way though. And click OK. Now to apply this gradient to my text. Now if you're familiar with the gradient tool, which we had reviewed in the tools webinars, the last two webinars that we did, to apply a gradient, I simply click and drag in the direction I want to apply. So notice I have this little plus sign as my cursor. I'm going to go from top to bottom. So I'm going to start at the top of the text and then hold down Shift to make it a straight line and release my mouse when I get to the bottom. And there's my gradient. Or if I wanted to go from left to right, I simply click and drag from left to right. And there's my gradient. So using the gradient tool in this second method of applying gradient to a text gives me more flexibility. You can also do diagonally if you so choose. Okay, so that's how you can do gradient text, and it may be a way just to make your text pop a little bit more. Maybe use colors that are in the image behind or your document behind the text to make so it matches your other information, but it creates text that can be a little more interesting and makes it pop more in the right scenario. All right, let's go back to the next text effect that we will apply. Whoops. The next one that we're going to do is putting a picture inside text. Again, I'm going to show you two different methods of doing this. We're going to open an image inside Photoshop that we want to use. In the first method, we're going to do a clipping mask. So you'll see me do these steps A through E in the document inside Photoshop. That's probably the quickest and easiest way to placing an image inside text. I'll also show you a second method using what we call the Type Mask tool. Again, we talked more about the Type Mask tool in a previous webinar when we were going through the tools, but I'm going to use that tool to create what we call a mask, which will then make a selection of parts of the image that will correspond to my text. Then I'll add some layer styles to that to make the text pop a little bit. So let me show you how to do this inside Photoshop. I'm going to go to an image. I'm going to show you the first method, which is using what we call a clipping mask. So I'm going to start the process by grabbing my text tool, and I'll just type in the words. Actually, I'm going to make a smaller text here so it fits the image better. And the color of the text really doesn't matter because eventually we're going to be using the picture itself. So there's my text. I'm going to actually move this text down a little bit so I have more of the flowers inside this word. When you're doing this method, you do want to make sure that you're using a font that has a what we call fairly wide font. You don't want to use a very narrow because you won't grab much of the image and you may not even see the image inside the text. Use a fairly wide font. Actually, this one here may be a better option. No, I'll stick with the one that we had. Yeah, we'll stick with the one that we had. Okay, so I've typed in the text, and the next step is I'm going to duplicate this background layer, which is the image that I want to use inside this text. So to duplicate a background, there's several ways to do this. I use keyboard shortcut. It's Control-J or Command-J. So I've selected the layer in my Layers panel. Press Control-J or Command-J on the Mac side, and you get a duplicate layer of your duplicate layer of the selected layer. For now, I'm going to turn off the background layer, so I'm only working, so you can only see the duplicate copy. I've typed in the text. I'm going to move this copy of my image above my text layer. So notice how I did that. I have my background copy and then my text layer, which we no longer see because it's behind this layer. I can turn this off temporarily. So there it sits. Now I'm going to right-click on this duplicate layer. One of the options is Create Clipping Mask. What that's going to do is going to move this image into the layer below it. And it's indicated by this little arrow on the left side pointing down to the layer below. So it moved the content of that layer into the layer below it, which in this case was text. Now I can move this around. So right now I'm actually moving the image around. As you can see within the text, I see different parts of an image. If I move it down far enough, it should get more of the purples and greens at the top. So you can move that image around inside there, or if I click on my text layer, I can move the text around the image below it. So kind of the same effect, just moving different aspects. One is you're moving the text, the other is you're moving the image within the text. And that what you're moving is dependent on what is selected in your layers panel. So that gives you a nice effect. I'm not sure what this will look like, but now I could maybe, if I'm going to turn on my background layer, kind of hides that. I could add some layer styles to make that stand out more. And I'm going to actually do that when we use the mask type tool, so you'll see that done there. Or if I didn't want this, maybe I just want to go with another image behind it, or maybe just a shape that covers behind it with a different color. Let's just experiment here for a little bit. Whoops, I'm still in my clipping mask. Let's get rid of that. And now we'll put that below there. And then I could add other aspects to this document. Maybe it was an announcement about some kind of wildflower festival or something like that. So that's how you can put a picture inside the image. Okay, let me show you the other method of doing this. Let me get rid of these layers. And we'll start with our original image. And the other one is, instead of using a clipping mask, I can use a variation of the type tool, which is the horizontal type mask tool. I'm going to simply click on that and then type in the word lavender. I'm going to make this bigger. And you'll notice this time as we type the word in, we get this orange layer over it. That's the mask. And it's used to make selections, basically. I'm going to move this down a little bit. I'm moving my cursor until I get the little move tool. And I move my text down to here. It's important to move your text where you want it before we click on accepting this text. So I move that down to where I want it. Then up here in the control bar, I'm going to click on the check mark to accept the selection. And you're going to see what happens here. When I accept that, it simply makes a selection of the text that I just typed in there. Notice the moving lines around the text characters. With the moving lines, I'm going to do a edit copy or Control C or Command C on the Mac side. That's going to copy what's inside those moving lines. I'm going to make a new layer by going to my layers panel at the bottom, click on the new layer icon. Then I'm going to paste into that new layer. That's not real apparent yet, but if I turn off my background, that's what my second layer, or the layer I just created, looks like. So I copied it and then pasted it by doing an edit paste or Control V on the Windows side or Command V on the Mac side. I'm going to do something interesting with this. I'm going to leave it placed where it's at. I'm going to turn back on the image that's below it. And now we can't see it because it's the same thing, basically. But I'm going to add some layer styles to this layer to make it stand out a little bit. So I'm going to go down to my effects icon at the bottom of my layers panel. Let's start with a drop shadow. I don't know if you can see that behind there. You'll see the text start to pop a little bit. You may not be able to see that on the video, but let's make this a little more obvious. So there is a drop shadow there. I don't know if increasing that will make that much difference there. Just maybe a little bit. Let's also add a stroke. So I'm going to, on my layer style dialog, I'm going to also turn on stroke there to put a nice lavender stroke on there as well. Actually, to make this a little more apparent, I'm going to change the color of that stroke to a white. There we go. Maybe not quite so white like that. Now you can kind of see behind there what's happening, and I could work on some other things here. Maybe a bevel and emboss will make it stand out even more. Like so. Click OK. Now you can see the effect of what that does. So it's very subtle because of how we did that. I could actually, if I wanted to move this around, again, I'm still on my text layer, and do something like that. Okay. So I was using the type mask tool to make a selection and then adding layer styles to that and then placing it accordingly. Yeah, there's a question out there about just doing a solid color and then adding the effects to it. And you can do that as well, similar to when we were just introducing the text tool, we simply typed in our text. You could make before you type in the text, maybe pull a color. Let me demonstrate this really quick. Let's go back to our normal horizontal type tool. And let's stick with this kind of a lavender color and just type in some text there. Instead of bringing in the picture like we did with this effect, I could just stick with the solid color and apply the same effects. In fact, we can do that by like so. What I did there is I applied the same effects to this solid color text layer as we did with the layer that has the picture inside the text. And I did that. I could have gone into my effects dialog window and selected each one as we did with the picture in layer, but I just want to duplicate it, so I hold down my Alt key on this little FX icon on that layer. It'll be the Option key on the Mac side, and then click and drag that up into my new text layer to get to apply the same effects. So just a kind of a quick way of applying the same effects to another layer. But you're absolutely right. You can do those same effects on a solid color layer as we did on the text with a picture inside of it. Okay, let's go back to our text effects and move on to the next one. The next text effect that I want to show you is 3D text. And again, this can be used to just add variation to your text. Instead of just a flat text on or in a document or over an image, you can make it 3D. Now this has changed how you do 3D inside Photoshop in the later versions. Previously, you would just make a bunch of multiple layers of the same text and then move them pixel by pixel to get a bunch of layers that makes it look 3D-ish, but now it's much easier. Although I must admit I'm not real familiar with the 3D aspect inside Photoshop yet, but I know enough at least to show you how to use 3D to create 3D text. Actually, before we jump into Photoshop, just to review how we're going to do this inside Photoshop. We're going to just add our text, and then we're going to add what we call 3D extrusion, and I'll show you two different ways of doing that. And then we're just going to set the amount of extrusion. Extrusion means the depth of the text, if you will, and you'll see this demonstrated here shortly. Let's go back to just our plain document. Let's get rid of the text that we have already there. I'm going to simply add my text first. Let's go back to a stronger color so you can see it better on the video. And we'll type in some text. I'm going to set that text so it becomes a text layer. Now I'm going to apply or add 3D to this text. There's two ways to add 3D. One is to go to your window option, choose the 3D panel, which opens up this panel. Then you have, I think it will default to 3D postcard. You then choose 3D extrusion, click create. It's going to ask you if you want to switch to a 3D workspace. We'll say yes. And now it's turned it into a 3D text. Now to see this, I'm just going to click and turn this. Notice the depth of that text. That depth is what we refer to as extrusion. Let's say I don't want that to be quite that extreme or that deep. I can go in the Properties panel. This pops up when I choose to go to the 3D workspace. And there's this extrusion depth slider. If I bring that down, notice how that reduces the depth of that text. You can actually even go into the negative space and make it come out that way. But let's do something like 40 to 50. Now just to see this, you can see the 3D. When I'm in this 3D space, when I click and drag my mouse, you can rotate that however you deem necessary. Or you can also, again, this can be a little confusing working in a 3D mode. You can also use these axes to rotate the text around as well. So you can experiment with that if you want to do 3D text. I'm going to go back to my layers. Now you're going to get this 3D little box thing whenever you're on this layer. If I go back just my background layer, it's going to look a little more normal. Okay. I wanted to show you the other method of bringing up that 3D. We used it by going to the Window 3D option. You can also, let me see if I can, I'm just going to delete this and apply it again. Instead of going up here and selecting Window 3D, it can also right-click on this text layer in my Layers panel and go and select to do a new 3D extrusion. And that will do the same thing. Again, you have the slider up here to reduce that. I'm going to rotate that so I can see the depth a little more than what I would like and bring that down. Okay. Back to my Layers panel, go to my background to turn that off. So there's your 3D text. Let's go to the next effect, then we'll wrap up with showing you my favorite text technique. And we're doing pretty good with time. Yeah, there's a question about 3D, and if you're familiar with 3D, you can also apply what we call material, so it gives you more of a texture on your 3D, and that is possible inside Photoshop. I'm not familiar with that aspect of 3D. Someday I'll probably do maybe some webinars in 3D, so I'll force myself to learn all that. It is really surprising what you can do with 3D inside Photoshop. So you're more than welcome to experiment and just Google Photoshop 3D exercises or tutorials online, and you'll see some steps on how to do that. The next one I want to cover is text on a path or text on a shape. So maybe instead of just having a straight across text, maybe you want to arc it a little bit, or maybe you want to go on a circle and you want your text to wrap around the circle. Let me show you how you do that inside Photoshop. Let's get rid of our 3D text. Now be aware, when you start working in 3D, there is an icon over here that changes to a 3D aspect, and you can't get back to what we're used to. Like, for example, this is usually my gradient tool, but as it is now, I cannot get back to my gradient tool. That's because we're still in 3D workspace. So whenever I'm done working in 3D, I'm going to go to my window option of the main menu, go to workspace and choose essentials, which is my default workspace, to get out of that 3D mode. And now notice over here, when I click on this, now I can get back to my gradient tool or the paint bucket tool. I'm also going to close this 3D panel. All right, so we're looking at text on a path. Before we bring in the text, we need to create our path. So I'm going to show you two different ways. I'm going to create a path, and we'll put on that, then also create a shape and put text on that. So let's start creating a path. Again, this requires familiarity with the pen tool to create your path, at least how I'm going to show it. So I'm just going to do some kind of arc here. Actually, I'll do a kind of a curvy line to apply the text to, something like that. So there's our path. Now I'm going to go back or go to my text tool. When I grab my text tool, when I hover over the path, notice how my cursor changes into, it still has the little eye icon, if you will, but instead of a box around it, it goes in, it has a path cutting through that little eye, indicating, oh, I have a path. If you click now, I'll apply that text on this path. So I'm going to type in some text here. Like so. Let me get rid of this last just to make it fit. I'll just leave it like that. Now notice how it applies it against that path. Now if I click off of there, there's my text. I believe I can. Let me experiment. If I grab this tool, yeah. To move this text around along that path, I'm going to go to another tool right below my text tool is the, it's called the selection tool, and two variations is the path or the direct selection tool. I'm going to grab the direct selection tool. If I wanted to start the text here, I simply click on that and it moves the text to that spot. Or I could change also the direct selection, change my path a little bit to change how that shows up on the path. I'm going to bring that back to here, like so. So that's how you put text on a path. Let me show you how to put text on a shape. Very, very similar. I'm going to do, let's do a circle. So I'm going to grab my ellipse tool. I'm going to hold down Shift so I can create a perfect circle, like so. Now I want to put text on that. I'm going to change this so it's a white or there's no fill in that circle. Go back to my text tool and the same thing. When I grab my text tool, if I hover over the path, it turns into that little path, text path icon, if you will. If I go inside the circle and if I was to click there, it would place my text inside the circle. So it'd be like a paragraph text inside. Let me show you what I mean here. It keeps it inside there. That's really messy, but you get the idea. It keeps it inside there, inside this circle. Let me Control Z that out. Or let me just delete that. And now let's put the text actually around the circle. So I'm going to take my cursor, place it right on the line of that circle or the path of that circle when I have the little path indicator. Let's do a smaller text so it's going to show up a little bit better. And there's your text, in this case, around the circle. Again, I could go to my direct selection tool and change where that starts on the circle if I wanted to. Or I could also, I believe, change the shape of the circle. There's also an option. If I click on that, I can drag this around to also change the placement of the text. Another thing I can do is, I think I mentioned this earlier in the webinar, if I go to my text panel, character panel, there's a setting called baseline. If I want to move that text on how it shows up, maybe I want to go inside the circle or make it show up further away from the circle, I can change this baseline. So let's do, I probably need to select that text first before I do this. Oh, there it goes. When I do a minus negative, it moves it inside the circle. A minus, if I do a negative number, I should say it moves it inside the circle. If I do a positive number, it messes it up. Let me do this. I think I messed it up because I didn't have it selected. Let me do this one more time, get rid of that. Let me recreate this circle really quick. There we go. It retained that negative number for my baseline setting, so I'm going to change that to a 0, and it now puts out back around the circle. So that baseline setting controls where it shows up relative to the circle. Yes, there's a question about the different shapes. This applies to any shape. I'm showing you on a circle, but any of these shapes that you see in your shapes tool, this will work on that. It'd be interesting. There's a custom shape tool to experiment with that a bit too if you want to do some kind of custom shape with text around it. So it does apply to any shape. Good question. All right, let's wrap up. I'm going to show you my favorite text techniques, probably the most easiest of any of these that we looked at this morning. But it's a great job of making your text pop against a busy background, whether it's some kind of poster you're doing or just identifying an image. So in this case, we're just going to identify this image. And we're going to use just plain color text. And I want to pull out the color that's used in the image. So I'm going to set my foreground color by clicking on my foreground color box in my toolbar. and then taking what turns into an eyedropper over my image and select maybe a darker purple shade here. So I set my foreground color. I'm going to grab my text tool, and we'll keep that to 60 point size, and type in the text that I want to put on this. So that's actually, I mean, that you can read that pops up. I'm going to add another technique here to make that pop out even more. So I'm going to duplicate my text layer. So I have it selected in my layers panel. Command J or Control J duplicates the selected layer. You can also right click and also select duplicate layer. I'm going to turn off the top layer because I'm going to get to the text that's underneath the top layer, and I want to change the color of it. So I'm going to select that layer in my layers panel, grab my text tool, and select that text. I'm going to turn this into, in this case, I'm going to turn it into a white to make it really stand out. Sometimes you might turn it into a black, depending on the colors in your background, or you might use another color in your image. So there's my white text. I'm going to turn my other text layer back on, which is my dark purple text. So I no longer see my white text. However, with my white text still selected, which is the bottom layer, I'm simply going to nudge this layer a couple of pixels by using my down arrow key and my either left or right key, depending how I want to do this. I'm going to move it down just a couple. Notice how that makes it pop immediately. And also to the right, just a couple of spaces, just like that. So there's without the second text layer, and there's with the second text layer, which is a white, which makes that pop. It also makes it look 3D-ish, if you will. So that's another way to kind of make a 3D effect without using the 3D option. All right, we are approaching 10 till 9, so I want to wrap this up. Any other questions? Again, I certainly appreciate your questions and comments throughout the webinar. And I apologize, we had a little audio issue there at the beginning. That was my fault. Somehow I had clicked on mute audio. So hopefully that cleared up pretty quickly. Let's go back to our slides. So there's an explanation of how I did my favorite text technique. Yes, there's a question about getting a copy of the slides. I will include a link to the slides when I send out the recording, so you'll have that available. And it will also be available, excuse me, on the, will also be, sorry about that. It will also be available where you go to look at the recording. There'll be a link there as well to these slides, because I agree, these slides give you the details and the steps you need to apply these different text techniques. All right, so just a quick review on what we covered today. We did a quick overview of the text tool and some of the parameters that are available to us when using the text tool. We discussed just plain what we call title text versus what we call paragraph text, which is defining an area to put your text within. And that's more applicable to when you have lines of text. Then we looked at the 5 different text effects. We looked at how to do a gradient text, a couple ways of doing that. We looked at how to do a picture inside text. We looked at turning our text into 3D text. We also looked at placing text on a path or a shape. And then I showed you my favorite text technique. I need to give that some kind of a name of how I like to make my text pop often a lot. All right, a couple of links to some very helpful information when it comes to text effects. Actually, I should have opened this inside. I think I can click on this and open it. Some very helpful articles online that you can jump to, and again, I'll include these links in the recording. This article does a great job of going in depth about how to use a text tool, some of the things that we covered this morning, as well as other aspects and features that we kind of skimmed over or actually didn't even cover. So that's one article. This other article focuses more on text effects and shows you some other text effects that that can be very, very helpful. And he does a good job of going step by step for the most part. Okay, so those are 2 articles that I will include links for in the recording. Again, if you haven't already, I do have some free Photoshop videos. This isn't about text effects necessarily, but different. Actually, it covers the 6 most common questions asked about how to do something inside Photoshop. You can find that at that link, free Photoshop videos on my website. I also have a course. I'm working on a new course currently, but if you want to get access to the course that's out there right now before the new one comes out, it's at a reduced price at $27. You're welcome to do that. That's at Photoshop Online Training on my website. Again, I'll include all these links in the recording. I also have a YouTube channel. You're welcome to explore that. It's Onward Studios YouTube channel. And I do have a blog. If you just go to blog@onwardstudios.com, and where you can select different categories, select Photoshop, you'll see quite a few Photoshop tutorials out there on my blog. Again, if you want to get a hold of me, if you have any questions or anything maybe that you want me to cover in future webinars, send me an email, karma@onwardstudios.com, or you can go to my website and contact me through my website on the contact page form. You can also find me on Twitter and on Facebook at Onward Studios without the A at both of those, Twitter and Facebook, and of course my YouTube channel as well. All right, that wraps up this morning. Again, thank you all for joining us on these Friday mornings. And this is the 4th Friday, so it'll be mid-month next month on the 3rd and 4th Fridays where I will see just the Photoshop people again. And we'll start into selections. I think selections is one of the main features and aspects of Photoshop. It's how you move something from one image to another, how you remove things from an image. It's probably one of the most used techniques inside Photoshop. And I'm going to show you how you can make those selections in probably the next 2 webinars. If you're interested in WordPress, I also cover WordPress on the first 2 Fridays of each month. So I believe all of you are on my newsletter, so you can see how to sign up for the WordPress webinars via my newsletter. All right, again, thank you all for joining us. I appreciate you taking your time out of your schedules to join us on these Friday morning webinars, and I enjoy doing them as well. Have a great weekend.